Welcome to part 2 of our video series on the history of Alcatraz Island. In the first video, we discussed the island prior and up to European discovery. If you want to check that out first, a link will be available in the upper right-hand corner and in the description. Today we will take a look at the time after the island's discovery, its time as a military base, and finally the circumstances leading up to it finally being converted into the infamous prison we know it as today. In 1822, Mexico was granted independence from Spain, and the Mexican government inherited the land of California as a result. Despite the area of San Francisco, which at this time was called Yerba Buena, holding much potential, they elected to focus on development in the southern lowlands of the state. Over 2 decades later, in May of 1846, the relationship between the Mexican and U.S. government shattered, leading to the U.S. Congress declaring war. Prior to this, Mexican California had seen a large influx of foreigners coming into the territory from America. Distrustful of these American immigrants, California authorities attempted several methods of cracking down on them that ultimately proved unsuccessful and caused social unrest. On top of all this, the territory had been neglected by the Mexican government for the better part of the last 30 years. When U.S. Army Lieutenant John C. Fremont's third exploratory expedition made their way into California and started creating problems for local authorities almost immediately, Americans in California formed a militia and, with some encouragement from Fremont, sprung into action against their local government, storming the barracks at Sonoma and capturing its commanding officer. A couple of weeks later, the group raised a white flag with a bear embroidered on it and the words California Republic written across the middle. Appropriately, this event was named the Bear Flag Revolt, and a version of this flag still flies as the California state flag to this very day. Not content with just one garrison, the militia marched south and seized several other forts, including the one in Yerba Buena, which was officially renamed San Francisco shortly after. Their victory was ultimately short-lived, however, as 2 U.S. warships arrived in San Francisco and informed the militia that California was now a U.S. jurisdiction and placed the entire state under martial law.
Look at me, sure. Look at me, sure. I'm the captain now.
Fremont's role in our story was not done yet, however. Years before the war, the Mexican government issued a decree allowing for governors to issue land titles to citizens who would agree to develop the land. In June of 1846, the last Mexican governor of California granted one such title to a man named Julian Workman for the land of Alcatraz. The agreement stated Workman would develop a lighthouse on the island, though possibly due to the war, Workman never visited the island or made any attempt to develop such a lighthouse. In 1847, Fremont purchased the land title in the name of the U.S. government from Workman's son-in-law for an agreed-upon $5,000, though Fremont quickly turned around and conveyed the land to the Palmer Cook & Company Bank and never ended up paying Workman's son-in-law a cent for it. Fremont was later appointed to the position of governor by U.S. Senator Robert F. Stockton, though karma seemed to come back and strike Fremont as the federal government not only disputed his appointment as governor, but further ruled he had no authority to make purchases on their behalf. Palmer Cook & Company filed a lawsuit to try and maintain their ownership of the land, but it was ruled that Fremont's purchase of the island had been illegal. He would later be court-martialed for this and other accusations of corruption, and was dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Army.
Well, I guess the joke's on me.
The discharge was short-lived, however, as President Polk commuted his sentence and reinstated him into the military, where he would go on to have an immensely interesting life that could be a subject of a video in and of itself. Despite being the owner of Alcatraz for just a brief moment, Fremont did make an astute observation about the island's strategic value due to its positioning at the mouth of the San Francisco Bay. After the Mexican-American War ended in 1848, the U.S. military took notice of this and began to send surveyors to Alcatraz. There were no immediate plans for a fortress on the island, but unforeseen circumstances would soon force the Army's hand. In January of 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall discovered tiny gold nuggets floating in a riverbank in Coloma, California. While the initial news of these findings was relatively underplayed in the press, within the next few months the story blew up and a surge of prospectors and miners swarmed into California hoping to make their fortune. San Francisco watched its population balloon from less than 400 in 1848 to more than 30,000 the following year. With a gold fever sweeping the globe, the federal government invoked security measures to protect its land's mineral resources from foreign invaders. One of the areas they identified as an ideal strategic point of defense was Alcatraz Island, and quickly commissioned the building of a military installation upon it. In 1849, before the government had begun construction of this fortress, the San Francisco harbor was quickly becoming a bustling shipping port, and a lighthouse was sorely needed to help these vessels navigate. A Baltimore firm was contracted to begin construction of a lighthouse on the western portion of the island, and in 1853 they arrived and began their work. On November 1, 1850, a military commission presented a detailed report outlining a defense plan to protect San Francisco from foreign powers using a fortress on Alcatraz. The commission also urged immediate development of this fortification to solidify protection of the still young U.S. territory. After several more years of logistical planning, construction finally began in 1854 with a $500,000 congressional appropriation. First Lieutenant Zealous Bates Tower was assigned to manage the construction of the fortress, with Second Lieutenant Frederick Prime as his assistant. Problems began almost immediately due to the rough topography of the island's surface, causing issues that the engineers planning the fortress hadn't anticipated. A landslide in 1857 claimed the lives of 2 laborers who would become the first of many casualties throughout the island's history. The stone also proved to be too fragile to be used in the fort's construction, resulting in granite and brick needing to be shipped from as far away as China. On New Year's Eve 1857, Second Lieutenant James Birdseye McPherson was assigned to take over for Tower as the construction supervisor. He quickly came to regret his assignment and often wrote in letters to his friends and family of the awful living conditions on Alcatraz. Nonetheless, he proved an effective commander that kept his men on task, and within a few years, Alcatraz was finally established as the United States symbol of military strength in the West. McPherson left Alcatraz in 1861. A short time after the American Civil War broke out. He was eventually elevated to the rank of general, but was tragically killed in the Battle of Atlanta in July of 1864. The fortress of Alcatraz was indeed a sight to behold. Sporting more than a half-mile of wall made from brick and sandstone, as well as long-range cannons such as the massive 36,000-pound Rodman guns, which could fire on enemy ships up to 3 miles away. At its peak during the end of the war, the island boasted 129 cannons around its perimeter. However, this artillery would go unused for the majority of the fortress's lifespan. In the years following the Civil War, it was quickly becoming obsolete as a fortification, with newer modern weaponry invalidating the once impressive array of cannons it held. Throughout the Civil War, captured Confederate soldiers slowly began to trickle into the island fortress, with the earliest arriving in August of 1861. The isolation of Alcatraz made it an ideal location to send POWs, as the odds of them attempting an escape were very low given the surrounding waters. However, since it wasn't initially designed with this purpose in mind, the condition these POWs were kept in were quite bleak. Cramped hot cells that lacked basic sanitation also made them a hotbed for diseases that would spread to the soldiers stationed at the fort as easily as it did through the POWs. This was made worse by the grueling physical labor these inmates were subjected to during their time at the fortress. This problem was exacerbated after President Lincoln signed an executive order allowing state officials the authority to arrest anyone who publicly advocated for the Confederate cause. After the end of the war, the commander of the Army's Department of the Pacific officially designated Alcatraz a place of confinement for military prisoners given lengthy sentences. Soon after, the government began sending Native Americans deemed troublesome to the island, but the definition of that word proved to be loose at best. Some of the American Indians sent hadn't been convicted of any crimes at all and were only there for what the government described as safekeeping. A group of Hopi Indians were sent there after refusing to cooperate with a government initiative to Americanize Native children and enroll them in boarding schools built for this specific purpose. These schools were not only far away from the children's families, but were shoddily built and inadequate to accommodate hundreds of children, making disease a realistic and understandable concern. The Hopi kept their resistance to this peaceful, but many were thrown in jail anyway, including many tribal leaders. In addition, the U.S. government sent troops to their villages to intimidate them, and in general acted in a very dickish manner about what in reality was a perfectly reasonable fear. After spending months locked away in the island prison, the Hopi Indians eventually agreed to the government's terms and allowed their children to attend the boarding schools. In 1907, Alcatraz was designated as the Pacific Branch United States Military Prison, and 2 companies of prison guards were permanently garrisoned there. Finally, in 1909, a full design was sketched out for the modern prison facilities, and a $250,000 budget was granted to prison officials for its construction. A new lighthouse was built along with a massive new prison building with modern facilities that was designed to hold up to 600 inmates at a time. The average prisoners were just 24 years of age, and included servicemen who had been arrested for crimes as petty as public drunkenness to more severe charges such as assault and murder. Alcatraz was actually considered a minimum security prison at the time. Inmates were allowed to roam free of their cells during the day, and all were given work assignments such as cooking, laundry duty, cleaning, and for the most trustworthy prisoners, even child care for the guards' families. They were also permitted to participate in several activities such as baseball and, most popular of all, boxing matches, which even drew civilian spectators who were well connected enough to find tickets to the island. However, due to the laid-back nature of the facility, several escape attempts were made, though the inmates often failed due to the rough waters of the San Francisco Bay. In 1933, the Army decided to close the prison due to operating costs and transferred the facility to the Department of Justice, who was in the midst of a battle of their own with a newer and deadlier form of organized crime. Join us in our next and final video in this series, where we discuss Alcatraz during this new era, where the prison would achieve legendary status, earning the nickname The Rock. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you can be updated whenever we post something new. This is Crime Spot, and thank you for watching.